They told everyone I was dead before I ever realized I had disappeared, and by the time the truth reached me, the lie had already settled comfortably into other people's lives, like it belonged there. And that is the most disturbing part of this story. Not that they claimed I died, but that they were able to live so easily with that claim because it solved something for them. It erased debts, it erased explanations, it erased me, and allowed them to move forward lighter, richer, and unburdened. While my name was being spoken in hushed tones and printed beneath donation links and sympathy messages, I was very much alive, breathing, working, existing, just far enough away for them to think they could finish the story without interruption. And I want to tell this myself, because for months they told it for me, and they told it wrong. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and according to my own family, I died suddenly, tragically, and conveniently. And everyone believed them, because grief, when performed well, looks a lot like truth. And the first time I learned about my death was not through a phone call or a visit or even concern. It came through a message meant for someone else, a brief line expressing condolences and gratitude for allowing the community to support my family in their time of loss. And I remember reading it slowly, confused at first, then unsettled, then cold, because the words did not feel mistaken, they felt rehearsed. And when I searched my name, I found memorial posts, framed photos, captions written in past tense, stories of my kindness and my struggles, stories that ended with donation links created to help cover medical bills, funeral costs, and outstanding obligations. And buried inside those obligations was the money they owed me, money I had lent quietly over years to my brother and his wife, under the promise that family helps family, and that repayment would come when things stabilized. But things never stabilized, because every time they improved, there was a new excuse, a new delay, a new reason to ask for patience, until patience turned into expectation, and expectation into entitlement, and eventually entitlement into something they believed I would never collect, because collecting would require confrontation, and confrontation would require acknowledging what they had done. And when I took a work contract overseas with limited communication, they saw their opportunity. Not consciously at first, perhaps, but gradually, like a thought that grows bolder each time it goes unchallenged. They told people I had been in an accident. They said I was hospitalized. Then they said complications arose. Then they said I wasn't responding. And when concern turned into fear, and fear demanded updates, they filled the silence with certainty, because certainty comforts people, and certainty keeps questions away. And when someone finally suggested collecting donations to help with expenses, they did not refuse. They accepted with visible reluctance and quiet gratitude. And that was all it took. Because once money changed hands, the lie became an investment, and investments are protected fiercely. I did not rush home when I found out. I did not confront them immediately, because shock has a way of slowing you down and making you observe instead of react. And what I observed was horrifyingly thorough. They had timelines prepared, stories aligned, explanations practiced. They had already held a memorial service without a body, citing private wishes and complications. They had already received condolences from people I had known my entire life, people who now believed I was gone. And when I finally called my brother, his voice did not sound relieved. It sounded alarmed. And when I said my name and said I was alive, there was a pause so long it told me everything I needed to know, because relief does not hesitate, and love does not require time to calculate. And in that pause, I realized this was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision. And once that settled inside me, something hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. Because anger demands release, and I was not ready to release anything yet. I was ready to listen, to document, to wait. They asked me not to come back right away. They said it would confuse people. They said everyone was fragile. They said we should talk privately. And that word, privately, confirmed what I already knew, because they did not want truth. They wanted control, and control is easiest when the subject stays silent. So I stayed silent longer than they expected. I let them finish mourning me. I let them believe the chapter was closed, because grief makes people careless, and careless people leave trails, and I followed every one of them. Screenshots of donation pages, bank transfers, messages explaining delays, stories that contradicted each other depending on who was listening. I learned who was told I died instantly and who was told I lingered. I learned who believed I had debts and who was told I left nothing behind. I learned how borrowed money was reframed as shared burden, how repayment became impossible because the creditor was dead. And hearing my name spoken that way, as if my absence solved something, did not hurt the way you might expect. It clarified things, because once you accept that someone benefited from your erasure, you stop wondering whether they loved you and start preparing for what comes next. And what came next was not dramatic or loud, it was careful and deliberate. Because truth without structure is just a story, and stories can be dismissed. But truth wrapped in evidence becomes something else entirely, something that demands attention and accountability. And as I worked with my lawyer, quietly assembling timelines and records, I felt no grief for them, only a strange calm, because you cannot miss people who required your death to live comfortably. And when the court date was set and the filings were complete, I did not feel nervous, I felt ready. Because I was not going to court to beg to be believed, I was going to court alive, calm, and carrying evidence they never imagined would surface. And they would see me again, not as a memory, not as a photograph framed in black, but as a living contradiction to the lie they had built their peace on. And that was when their mourning would truly end. I stayed officially dead, while they grew comfortable with my absence. And comfort makes people sloppy in ways fear never does, because once they believed there was no version of reality where I could return, they stopped guarding their words, stopped aligning their stories, and stopped checking whether one lie contradicted another. And I watched that unraveling patiently from a distance, like someone studying a map before a long walk, knowing every wrong turn would eventually lead them exactly where I needed them to be. And during that time, I learned how my death had been useful to them in ways I never imagined, because it did not just erase a debt, it rewrote their identities. My brother became the grieving sibling, the responsible one, burdened by loss. My sister-in-law became the brave caretaker, navigating tragedy with strength and grace. And people treat you very differently when they believe you have suffered quietly and unjustly. They forgive inconsistencies, they overlook details, they open their wallets and their hearts and say things like, "Let them be, they've been through enough." And every time someone said that, it bought them more time, more money, and more insulation from questions. And what none of those people knew was that I was listening to everything through forwarded messages, casual screenshots, recordings sent by well-meaning acquaintances who had no idea they were contributing to a legal file instead of a sympathy scrapbook. And each piece fit somewhere. Some contradicted dates, some exposed amounts that did not align, some revealed that donation money meant for medical bills was spent on travel, renovations, and leisure, and none of it would have been enough on its own, because lies are good at hiding inside emotion, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns are what courts understand best. And while they were busy rewriting history, I was reconstructing it with timestamps and sworn statements. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became that this was not a moment of desperation that spiraled out of control. It was a gradual choice, repeated often enough to become strategy, because they had opportunities to stop. They had moments where the lie could have been corrected quietly, but each time they chose the version that benefited them most. And that is how you know intent. When harm continues, not because it must, but because it pays. And there was a moment, months in, when I considered reaching out to warn them, to give them a chance to undo what they had done before consequences became unavoidable. But that thought passed quickly, because chances are meant for people who show remorse, not for people who build comfort on your erasure. And by then, they were very comfortable. They spoke about me as if I were a lesson, a chapter, a tragedy that shaped them into better people. And that was perhaps the most surreal part. Hearing my name used as character development for someone else's story, while I sat alive taking notes. And the day before the hearing, I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to remember what I looked like before I walked back into a world that believed I no longer existed. And I did not dress dramatically or choose anything symbolic. I dressed plainly, deliberately, because shock does not come from appearance, it comes from reality, and reality would be enough. And when I entered the courthouse, I did not seek them out, I did not look for their faces, because anticipation belongs to people who doubt themselves, and I had no doubt. I checked in quietly, I sat where I was told, and I waited while the court proceeded with other matters. And when their case was called, they stood, confident, composed, already rehearsed in their grief, and their attorney spoke calmly about financial hardship, unresolved obligations, and community support raised in the aftermath of an unexpected loss. And as he spoke, I watched their posture relax, familiar, reassured by the rhythm of a story they had told many times before. And then my attorney stood and asked the court for permission to introduce new evidence related to the standing of the alleged deceased. And the word alleged shifted something in the room, like a current change that most people did not consciously notice, but bodies do, because when something no longer fits, people feel it before they understand it. And the judge looked down at the file, looked up at my attorney, and asked for clarification. And my attorney said clearly that there appeared to be a misunderstanding regarding the status of the individual whose death formed the basis of the claims, and that clarification would be provided immediately. And that was when the judge asked me to stand. And I did. And the sound that followed was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was not a gasp or a scream. It was the sound of air leaving lungs all at once, the kind of sound people make when something impossible becomes undeniable. And my brother turned slowly, as if movement itself required permission, and when his eyes met mine, the color drained from his face so quickly it was almost impressive, because recognition does not lie, and neither does fear. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there is no script for the dead standing up and breathing. And then the judge asked a simple question. Are you Eleanor Brooks? And I answered, yes, clearly, calmly. And the room shifted fully into something else, something grounded and unavoidable, because emotion had no place to hide anymore. And my attorney began presenting documentation, proof of life, employment records, travel records, sworn affidavits, communications that showed awareness of my survival long before donations were collected. And each piece was entered into record. I watched my sister-in-law's hands tremble, not violently, but subtly, because she understood before anyone else did that this was not a misunderstanding hearing. This was an exposure, and exposure does not negotiate. And when the judge asked if the defendants wished to respond, their attorney hesitated, because attorneys understand when a case collapses, and collapse had already begun. And what followed was not shouting or denial. It was confusion, poorly masked as shock, statements about misinformation, about assumptions, about believing what they had been told. And each explanation contradicted the last, because lies built over time cannot be dismantled cleanly. They come apart in layers, revealing intent beneath. And when questioned about the donations, the explanations unraveled completely. Amounts did not align, purposes shifted, and responsibility was passed back and forth like something too hot to hold. And through it all, I stood quietly, because I did not need to speak yet. My existence was already louder than anything I could say. And when I finally did speak, it was only to answer direct questions clearly, factually, without accusation, because truth does not need theatrics to be devastating. And as the hearing concluded, the judge ordered a full investigation into fraud, misrepresentation, and misuse of funds, and set additional dates for proceedings that would not be resolved quickly, because justice, when delayed by deception, takes time to reassemble. And as everyone was dismissed, I watched the people who had buried me avoid my eyes, because facing me now meant facing the cost of a lie they had lived comfortably inside. And I realized in that moment that resurrection is not about revenge. It is about reclaiming reality and forcing those who distorted it to live in it again. And that was only the beginning, because courtrooms are not where consequences end. They're where they begin. I did not feel victorious when the courtroom emptied, because victory implies celebration, and there was nothing to celebrate about discovering how easily people can erase you when it benefits them. What I felt instead was finality, the quiet kind that settles after something long and distorted is forced back into its proper shape. And in the weeks that followed, that finality hardened into consequence, because investigations do not move emotionally, they move methodically, and methodical truth is merciless. The donation accounts were frozen, audits were ordered, statements were taken from people who had been told different versions of my death, and each retelling peeled away another layer of protection they thought grief had given them. And what surprised many people was not that they were required to return the money, but that apologies stopped mattering once intent was established, because remorse after exposure is not repentance, it is damage control. And the court was not interested in how bad they felt, only in what they did and why they kept doing it, even after they knew I was alive. And that question followed them everywhere, into interviews, into filings, into whispered conversations that no longer stayed private, because once a lie is legally acknowledged, it stops being a secret and starts being a record. And records have a way of outliving excuses. My brother stopped calling after his first attempt was met with silence, because silence is sometimes the clearest boundary. My sister-in-law wrote long messages explaining fear, desperation, confusion, but none of those explanations answered the only question that mattered, which was why my death was more useful to them than my life. And there is no answer to that question that does not indict the person giving it. And as the months passed, settlements were reached, funds were returned, penalties were imposed, and reputations quietly dissolved, not in dramatic headlines, but in closed doors, lost trust, and the subtle shift in how people looked at them when they entered a room. Because people forgive mistakes more easily than they forgive manipulation disguised as grief. And I watched all of it from a distance, not because I was hiding, but because I no longer needed proximity to feel resolved. My name was cleared publicly, my status corrected legally, and the story they told finished rewriting itself without my help. And what remained was a strange, unexpected peace. Because when you survive something like that, you learn that closure is not reconciliation. It is understanding. And understanding does not require forgiveness. It requires clarity. And I had that clarity, fully, completely, and without doubt. They did not love me enough to face me alive, and that knowledge freed me from ever needing their approval again. I returned to my life quietly, resumed work, rebuilt relationships with people who had been misled, and most of them apologized, not for believing the lie, but for never questioning it. And I told them the truth, which was that lies wrapped in emotion are difficult to challenge, and that is why they spread so easily. And I moved forward, not as someone resurrected, but as someone reclaimed, because I was never gone. I was simply erased, temporarily, by people who mistook my silence for absence and my kindness for weakness. And if there is one thing I learned from being mourned while alive, it is that you do not need to prove your worth to people willing to profit from your disappearance. You only need to show up intact, undeniable, and holding the truth long enough for it to speak for itself. Because the dead cannot testify, but the living can, and I did. And that was the end of the story they told, and the beginning of the one I chose to keep.